You did not choose your next thought. Pause on that. Before you move past it, before the mind does what the mind always does, which is to immediately generate a response, a rebuttal, a qualification, a distraction, stay with the bare fact of it for just a moment. You did not choose your next thought. It arrived. The way weather arrives, the way a sound arrives from outside a window. It appeared in your awareness, carrying whatever content it carried, wearing whatever emotional colouring it wore, and the moment it appeared it felt like yours, like something you were doing rather than something happening to you, like an activity of the self rather than an event in the field of consciousness that the self observes. This confusion, this fundamental, persistent, almost universal confusion between the thinker and the thought, between the one who is aware and the contents of that awareness, is what Osho spent 40 years trying to dissolve, not to fix, not to improve, to dissolve, because his central claim, the claim that organizes everything else in his vast and deliberately unsystematic body of teaching, is that the confusion is not a mistake you are making. It is a structure, a deeply wired, culturally reinforced, almost irresistible structure of identification that keeps you living in a very small room inside a very large house, convinced that the room is everything there is. Osho, born Chandra Mohan Jain in 1931 in central India, later known as Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, later still as Osho, a name he took from William James's word oceanic, was by any measure one of the most provocative, most controversial and most intellectually alive spiritual teachers of the 20th century. He was also by any measure a man whose life generated as much shadow as light, whose Oregon commune became a study in the pathology of collective unconscious identification, whose relationship with institutional power was deeply troubled, whose statements on almost every subject were designed to destabilize rather than reassure. He knew this about himself. He talked about it. He seemed, at certain moments, to regard the controversy as the teaching, as though the discomfort he generated was itself a pointing toward the thing he was pointing at, the thing that cannot be grasped comfortably, that cannot be fitted into the existing categories without losing what makes it important. What he was pointing at was not a philosophy, not a belief system, not a set of practices that, if followed correctly, would produce a specified outcome. He was pointing at something that he consistently refused to name directly because the naming, he said, was part of the problem. The mind that receives a name for the thing immediately converts the name into a concept, the concept into an object, the object into a possession, and the possession into a new form of the same prison it was supposedly escaping. He called it, when pressed, your nature, your original face, the witnessing consciousness, the space in which thoughts appear, the awareness that is present before thought, during thought, and after thought, that is never itself a thought, never reducible to a thought, never capturable by the thought that tries to capture it. And here is the claim that this script is going to follow, through all its uncomfortable implications to wherever it leads. You are that, not the thoughts, the awareness in which thoughts arise. You have never been the thoughts. You cannot be the thoughts, for the same reason that the screen cannot be the movie, because the screen is what makes the movie possible, and the movie, however vivid, however convincing, however completely it fills the screen, does not change what the screen is. The thoughts are vivid. The story they tell feels completely real. The character they construct, the one with your name, your history, your fears and desires, and self-image and plans, feels absolutely, undeniably, urgently real, and that character is not you. This is where most people stop. This is the point at which the mind, having processed the claim, produces one of several defensive responses. The claim is too abstract to take seriously, or it is taken seriously but immediately converted into a belief. I believe I am not my thoughts, which is itself just another thought, and therefore misses the point entirely. Or it generates a kind of vertigo, a sense that if this is true, something important is at stake, something is threatened, something that feels like me is being challenged, and the vertigo is immediately resolved by moving away from the claim, finding something more manageable to think about. Osho was familiar with all of these responses. He spent 4 decades watching them occur in people who came to him from every background and tradition and level of intellectual sophistication. And his response to each of them was the same, delivered with the specific, unhurried patience of someone who has nowhere to go and nothing to prove. Look, just look. Not at the claim. at the experience itself, not at what you think about your thoughts, at the space in which the thinking occurs. This script is an invitation to that looking, not a philosophy about it, not an argument for it, an invitation. 10 sections of sustained, patient, gradually deepening invitation to the single most important inquiry you can undertake, the inquiry into what you actually are, before the mind has answered the question on your behalf. Because it will answer on your behalf. That is what it does. The question, who am I, is the most dangerous question you can ask the mind, because the mind will immediately generate an answer, a biography, a role, a self-description, and present that answer with the full authority of the cognitive system that produces all answers. And the answer will be wrong. Not partially wrong, not wrong in the way that could be corrected by a better answer. Wrong in the way that an answer is wrong to a question that the answer-generating system cannot reach. The right response to "who am I?" is not an answer. It is silence. And in the silence, something becomes visible that the noise of thought had been covering. That something is where this begins. The mind never stops. This is the first thing you notice when you sit quietly for any length of time, when you remove the external stimuli that normally provide the mind with its raw material, when you stop feeding it with screens and sounds and social interaction and the forward momentum of tasks and obligations, when you simply sit. The first thing you notice is that the silence you expected to find is not silence at all. It is an extraordinary cacophony, a stream, no, a torrent, of images, memories, judgments, plans, anxieties, desires, commentary on the present moment, commentary on the commentary, the song that won't stop playing, the conversation you rehearsed and never had, the conversation you had and keep replaying, the worry about the future wearing the costume of strategic planning, the grievance about the past wearing the costume of self-understanding. On and on, without pause, without invitation, without your permission. The Buddhist traditions have a name for this, the monkey mind. The image is precise, a monkey in a tree, never still, always jumping from branch to branch, generating motion and noise and the appearance of purposeful activity, but going nowhere. Not because the monkey is bad, because jumping is what monkeys do. It is the nature of the monkey to jump, as it is the nature of the mind to think. The question is not how to stop the jumping. The question is whether you are the monkey or the one watching the monkey. Osho returned to this distinction across 40 years of discourse in every possible formulation, from every possible angle. He told it as story, as parable, as direct instruction, as Zen koan, as psychological analysis, as poetry. He told it in Hindi and in English. He told it to crowds of thousands and to small groups of sannyasins sitting in morning discourse. He told it in the great lecture halls of Pune and in the tents and meditation halls of the Oregon Ranch, and the telling always pointed at the same thing. You are not the monkey, you are the awareness in which the monkey moves. But the identifications are the convinced, habitual, unexamined identification with the content of the mind rather than the space of awareness is so total, so complete, so long established that the very suggestion feels threatening. Because if you are not the monkey, if you are the witnessing space rather than the stream of thought, then who is the one who has been suffering? Who is the one who is afraid? Who is the one with the name and the history and the self-image that has been defended and maintained and nurtured across a lifetime? Osho's answer was the most vertiginous thing he ever said, and he said it constantly. That one, the one with the name and the history, is a construct, not a reality. A story that the mind has been telling so long and so convincingly and with such emotional intensity that it has been mistaken for the storyteller. The ego, in Osho's language, is not something you have. It is something you do, a performance, an ongoing, energetically maintained activity of self-construction that masquerades as a discovery of self. Every thought that says, I am this or I am not that, every preference, every aversion, every judgment about what belongs to me and what doesn't, is a brick in the construction. The construction feels like a description of something real. It is the construction of something real, a functional identity, necessary for social existence, useful for navigating the world, but it is not you. It is something you have built and then forgotten you built and then moved into as though the building were the ground. And the mind that produces the construction is the same mind that then protects it, that flinches from this kind of inquiry, that generates immediate busyness whenever the inquiry gets close. Have you noticed that? the specific quality of mental noise that arises precisely when you begin to sit quietly and look as though the mind knows what the looking might find and is working to prevent it. Osho pointed at this with a directness that could be uncomfortable. The mind, he said, is not your friend in this inquiry. The mind has a vested interest in remaining identified with. If the identification dissolves, if you genuinely see that you are not the thinker, but the awareness in which thinking occurs, the mind does not disappear, but its relationship to you changes completely. It becomes a tool rather than a master, an instrument rather than an identity, a process you use rather than a process you are. And that shift, from being the mind to having the mind, from being inside the story to watching the story, from being the monkey to recognizing the one who watches the monkey, is the whole of what Osho was teaching. Not as a philosophy, as an event, a direct shift in the center of gravity of experience that cannot be described from the outside and cannot be missed from the inside. The question is how to arrive there, not through more thinking, which thinking about not thinking is still thinking, and the thinker thinking about the thinker is still the thinker, through something else, through the specific, simple, almost embarrassingly ordinary practice of watching, of noticing the thought as a thought, not evaluating it, not following it, not suppressing it, not arguing with it, just noticing, just the bare recognition. There is a thought. In that noticing, in that tiny gap between the thought and the awareness of the thought, is something that Osho spent 40 years pointing at with every word he spoke, something that you are. Between two thoughts, there is a gap. It is very small, almost imperceptible. The mind moves so quickly, generates content with such relentless efficiency, that the gap between one thought and the next is not ordinarily visible. You experience the stream as continuous, one thought flowing into the next with apparent seamlessness, the narrative of inner life proceeding without break, without pause, without the intrusion of any space that might interrupt the story. But the gap is there, and Osho considered the recognition of the gap, not conceptually, not as a belief, but as a direct, lived, experiential recognition, to be the most important event that can happen in a human life. Because the gap is not empty. This is the crucial thing. The gap between thoughts is not the absence of experience. It is the presence of awareness without content. Pure consciousness, not consciousness of something, just consciousness. The light without an object to illuminate. The knowing without a known. The space that makes the room possible rather than any of the furniture in the room. The mystics of every tradition have pointed at this gap. The Zen tradition calls it the space between thoughts and builds entire practices. The koan, the mondo, the sitting that is not meditation in the goal-oriented sense, around creating the conditions in which the gap might be recognized. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition describes the nature of mind as the open, luminous awareness that is visible in the gap between mental events. The Vedantic tradition calls it the witness, sakshi, the pure observing presence that is present throughout all the movements of the mind without being touched by any of them. The Christian mystical tradition, Meister Eckhart, the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing, John of the Cross, describes the same territory in different language. Emptiness that is fullness, darkness that is light, the nothingness that is the ground of everything. Osho drew on all of these traditions with a promiscuous generosity that irritated the orthodox in every one of them. He was not interested in any tradition's exclusive claim to the territory. He was interested in the territory itself, in whatever pointing, from whatever tradition, might help a contemporary person actually look in the right direction. And his own pointing, stripped of the specific cultural vocabulary of any single tradition, was consistently at the gap. He told a story, the kind of story he told constantly with the gift of a natural storyteller who understands that parable reaches where argument cannot, about a king who was troubled by his thoughts. The king could not sleep, could not rest, could not escape the relentless movement of the royal mind. He called his wisest advisors and demanded a solution. Many came with philosophies, with arguments about the nature of mind, with techniques for thought management. None of them helped. Then came a simple man, a gardener in some versions of the story, a madman in others, who asked the king a single question. The thought you are having right now, where did it come from? The king had no answer. The thought had simply appeared. It had no traceable origin in the king's intention or will. And where will it go when it leaves? The king had no answer. Thoughts disappeared the same way they arrived, without announcement, without permission, into a place that could not be located. "Then," said the simple man, "what are you? The thoughts are guests. They come and they go. The inn remains. You are the inn." The story is simple enough to seem too simple. This is a characteristic of the truth that Osho was pointing at here. It is not complicated. It is not the product of a long chain of sophisticated reasoning. It is available to anyone in any moment. The difficulty is not in understanding it, but in seeing it, not conceptually, but directly. The move from conceptual understanding to direct recognition is the whole of the spiritual journey, and it is a move that more thinking cannot make. In fact, and this is the part of Osho's teaching that most consistently disturbed his educated audiences, more thinking actively prevents it. Every effort to understand the gap through thinking about it produces more thinking. Every attempt to achieve the recognition of awareness through the instruments of thought produces more thought. The finger pointing at the moon is not the moon, and spending more time studying the finger produces a more sophisticated understanding of the finger, not a better view of the moon. This is why Osho valued meditation not as a method but as a de-method, not as a technique for achieving a state but as the relaxation of the effort to achieve, not as a discipline but as an undiscipline, the specific undoing of the mind's habitual effortfulness, the letting go of the project of becoming, the simple settling into what is already here when the project is abandoned. The gap is not something you create. The gap is what is always there when you stop filling it, and what fills it ordinarily is thought. The continuous, automatic, unchosen torrent of thinking that the mind produces as naturally as the body breathes, except that the body breathes for a good physiological reason, and the mind thinks mostly out of habit, the habit of being occupied, the habit of the identity that requires constant maintenance through the activity of self-referential thought, the habit of the one who cannot afford to be quiet because quiet is where the question lives that threatens everything the noise was built to prevent. Who are you when you're not thinking? Not who do you become? Who are you right now in the gap? Before the next thought has arrived and before the last one has been completed. In the space that is always here, and that thought continuously obscures. Osho spent his life pointing at that space. This pointing is the most important thing he did. The ego is not a thing, it is a habit. This distinction, small in words, enormous in implication, is the axis around which Osho's entire teaching about identity turns. If the ego were a thing, it would be something you have, something that could be analyzed, modified, improved or removed, something with substance, with a fixed nature that could be studied and understood. Therapy, philosophy, self-improvement, all of these would be adequate responses to something that has the nature of a thing. But if the ego is a habit, a pattern of activity, a repeated performance, an ongoing construction rather than a fixed structure, then it has a different nature and requires a different response. You cannot analyze a habit into dissolution. You cannot improve a performance into authenticity. You cannot add to a construction until it becomes the real thing it has been pretending to be. What you can do is stop the activity, drop the performance, cease the construction, even for a moment, and see what remains when the constructing stops. Osho's description of how the ego forms is precise and worth following carefully. The child is born without a self-concept. This is not a romantic claim about the innocence of infants. It is a developmental observation. The newborn has experience, has sensation, has, presumably, some form of awareness. But it does not have a self-concept. It does not have an I that it is aware of being. The I develops over the first years of life through a process that is simultaneously necessary and, in Osho's analysis, the root of all suffering. The process works like this. The child encounters the world and begins to receive information about itself from outside. You are good, you are bad, you're smart, you're difficult. You are loved, you're a problem, you're a joy. The information arrives continuously from parents, from siblings, from teachers, from the culture, and the child, having no pre-existing self-concept to evaluate the information against, takes it in as definition, as what I am, not as what others think of me, as what I am. Over years, these accumulated definitions solidify into a structure, a self-image, an ego, the specific, bounded, named, characterized person, that looks back at you from the mirror and that you have agreed without quite being aware of having agreed to anything to be. The agreement feels like discovery. It feels like you have found out who you are, rather than constructed who you are, because the construction happened before you were old enough to notice it occurring. And now the maintenance work begins, because the ego, once formed, requires continuous energy to maintain. Every interaction is evaluated for what it implies about the self. Every criticism is experienced as a threat. Every praise is hungrily consumed and quickly insufficient. Every comparison is assessed for its implications about relative worth. The energy budget of the average human life, the psychological energy, the attention, the emotional investment, is overwhelmingly devoted to the maintenance, defense, and enhancement of this structure that was built by accident out of other people's opinions. Osho called this the greatest irony of human existence. You spend your entire life defending something you didn't choose, maintaining something you didn't build, protecting something that isn't real, and calling it self-preservation. But here is where the teaching becomes specific and practically important. The prison of identity is not just uncomfortable, it is limiting in a very precise way. The ego, because it is defined by its boundaries, by its I am this and I am not that, is constitutionally incapable of experiencing what is beyond those boundaries. And what is beyond those boundaries is vast, immeasurably vast. The whole of existence, accessible to the awareness that is not contracted into a self-concept, is inaccessible to the awareness that is. Not because existence hides from you, because the contraction prevents you from seeing. This is the meaning of the phrase that appears in mystical literature across traditions, the death of the ego. Not a literal death, not the elimination of the functional persona that you need to navigate social reality. The death of the identification, the belief, the felt conviction, the moment-to-moment operating assumption that you are the construct. The recognition that you are the awareness in which the construct appears, that the ego is something you have been doing, not something you have been, and that you can, at least for a moment, stop doing it. What happens in that moment? Osho described it in many ways, using different vocabularies drawn from different traditions. He called it the state of no mind. He called it samadhi. He called it the experience of the present moment without the mediating filter of the self-concept. He called it simply freedom, not freedom from anything in the external world, freedom from the internal structure that has been filtering, interpreting, contracting, and limiting the experience of everything. The ego does not die easily. It has been practiced for decades. It is sustained by the entire social world which interacts with the construct rather than with the awareness behind it, and whose feedback continuously reinforces the construction. It is sustained by every mirror you look in, every name you respond to, every role you occupy. But it has one fatal weakness. It requires energy. Continuous, active, effortful energy. It is not the natural state, it is a sustained performance of a state. And performances, however long practiced, can be interrupted. The interruption may last only a moment, a gap between thoughts, a second of pure presence, a moment in which the performance is not occurring and something more fundamental is visible. In that moment, just that moment, you know what Osho spent his life pointing at, and the knowing, once it has been known, cannot be entirely unfelt. There is a meditation you have probably tried. You sat down, you closed your eyes, you tried to empty your mind. The thoughts kept coming, more thoughts than usual it seemed, as though the silence had given them permission to be louder. You told yourself you were doing it wrong, you tried harder. The harder you tried, the more thoughts arrived, because trying is itself a thought, and effortful trying is a particularly noisy thought, and the effort to have no thoughts is the most self-defeating thought you can have. You gave up, you concluded that meditation was not for you, or you concluded that you needed better technique, or you persisted, with the grim determination of someone who has decided that this good thing must be achieved regardless of the discomfort, and what you achieved was a more disciplined form of exactly the same experience you were trying to move past. Osho called this the great misunderstanding of meditation. Meditation, in the way he understood and taught it, is not the effort to stop thinking. It is the recognition that you are not the thinking. It is not a technique for controlling the mind. It is the discovery that there is something in you that has never been controlled by the mind and cannot be, because it is the space in which the mind moves, and the space cannot be controlled by what moves through it. The effort-based approach to meditation fails because it is based on a misunderstanding of what meditation is for. If you think meditation is a project, a thing to be achieved, a state to be produced, a goal to be reached by the correct application of the correct technique, then you will bring to it the same goal-oriented, effort-making, success and failure evaluating consciousness that produces the thinking in the first place. And that consciousness cannot meditate in the genuine sense, because genuine meditation is the relaxation of exactly that consciousness, not its more disciplined application. What Osho taught instead, across hundreds of specific meditation techniques, all of them variations on a single theme, was something closer to choiceless awareness, a quality of presence that is not produced by effort but is discovered when effort ceases. Not the effort of the body. You can sit, you can close your eyes, you can create the external conditions, but the internal effort, the trying, the managing, the evaluating of whether you're doing it correctly. When that ceases, not through another effort to cease it, but through the simple recognition that it is occurring and the gentle non-reinforcement of it, something is revealed that was already here. He developed a specific approach to this problem that was, in some ways, his most original contribution to the practical exploration of meditation. He called it dynamic meditation, and it is as far from the image of the serene, still meditator as anything could be. It begins with 10 minutes of chaotic, intense breathing, the body pushed to its physiological limits, the energy system activated. Then 10 minutes of catharsis, complete, total, unreserved expression of whatever arises. Screaming, crying, laughing, dancing, shaking. Everything that the socially managed, ego-maintained personality suppresses in the ordinary course of life, allowed to arise and move and pass through without management or judgment. The logic was precise. The ordinary meditator sits down in silence and asks the accumulated repressions and suppressions of a lifetime, the emotions that have never been fully felt, the experiences that have never been fully processed, the energy that has been locked into the maintenance of the ego structure, to be quiet while they meditate. This, Osho pointed out, is like asking a kettle full of steam to remain still while you put a heavy lid on it. The pressure doesn't disappear. It increases. The dynamic meditation worked differently. It used the pressure. It allowed the steam to move before asking for stillness. After the cathartic second stage, after the energy has moved and the accumulated content has had a moment of expression, the instruction is simple. Stop completely, freeze exactly where you are, and then, for 15 minutes of the purest silence the practice generates, just watch. Not try to be still. Just watch. The body is frozen. The catharsis has passed. The thinking has been disrupted from its habitual grooves by the preceding chaos, and in that disruption, in that unusual stillness that follows the storm rather than preceding it, something becomes visible that the ordinary entry into silence cannot access. The witness, the one who watched the chaos, the one who was present for the catharsis without being identical with it, the awareness that has remained, still clear, unmodified, through all the noise and movement and energy. That awareness is you, not the catharsis, not the thoughts, not the personality that the catharsis temporarily dissolved. The witnessing presence that was there before it started, present throughout, present after. Osho's various other meditation techniques, Kundalini, Nataraj, Nadabrahma, the evening meeting discourse, are all variations on this same pointing. They use different instruments, movement, sound, stillness, darkness, music, but they are all attempts to create the conditions in which the identification with thought can briefly relax, the witness can become visible, and the direct recognition of your nature as awareness, rather than content, becomes available. Not as a conclusion, as an experience. The experience, once even briefly available, is not easily forgotten, because it is not a new experience. It is the recognition of what was always here, always present, previously unnoticed. The experience of your own nature, prior to all the conditioning, prior to all the self-construction, prior to all the thinking. The experience of what Osho sometimes called home, the place you never left, but forgot you were in. Here is the trap within the trap. You have read up to this point approximately 6,000 words about the problem of being identified with thought, and the reading has been done, how? Through thought. The words have been processed by what? The mind. The concepts have been understood through what mechanism? Conceptual thinking. The very instrument that is being identified as the limitation is the instrument through which the limitation is being described. This is not an accident. Osho was aware of it constantly. He talked about it constantly. It is, in fact, the structural problem of all spiritual teaching that attempts to use language to point at what is prior to language. The finger pointing at the moon cannot be the moon. The thought about awareness cannot be awareness. The understanding of the teaching is not the same as the recognition the teaching is pointing at. And yet, and this is what saves the situation from pure futility, the pointing has a function. The right pointing, the right kind of language used in the right way, can do something that nothing else can do. It can create a disruption in the ordinary flow of thought. A pause, a moment of hesitation in the mind's usual automatic processing. And in that pause, in that barely there gap that the pointing creates, the thing being pointed at has a chance to be noticed. Osho understood this about language. His discourses, which run to hundreds of volumes, given over 30 years in daily sessions that sometimes lasted 2 or 3 hours, are not arguments. They are not philosophical treatises. They are not instruction manuals. They are, if you read them right, if you listen to the recordings right, something more like music. Not delivering information, but creating an atmosphere, a quality of presence, a space in which the ordinary mechanisms of the mind are gently, persistently, sometimes abruptly disrupted. He would begin a discourse with a joke, an outrageous joke, the kind that makes the audience laugh before they know they are laughing, that disrupts the decorum of the serious spiritual teaching mode they have come prepared for. Then he would say something simple, then something paradoxical, then something that directly contradicted what he had said 5 minutes ago, then something so beautiful that the mind stopped trying to evaluate it and simply received it. And in the gaps between these movements, in the laughter, in the paradox, in the beauty and the contradiction, the ordinary processing would pause, and in the pause, whatever the discourse was pointing at had room. This is what Zen calls a mondo, a dialogue designed not to convey information, but to produce an event in the consciousness of the one receiving it. An event that thinking cannot produce and thinking cannot prevent, but that the right kind of speech can create the conditions for. Osho taught this explicitly. Don't listen with the mind. Don't try to understand. Don't try to remember. Just listen. Let the words arrive the way music arrives, not analysed, not evaluated for logical consistency, not stored as propositions to be reviewed later. Let them land wherever they land and trust that something in you receives what the thinking mind cannot. This is not anti-intellectual. Osho was one of the most widely read people of the 20th century. His discourses reference Socrates and Freud and Nietzsche and Lao Tzu and Kabir and Buddha and Gurdjieff and Krishnamurti and hundreds of others with the familiarity of someone who has lived inside their thinking long enough to see both its gifts and its limits. He was not dismissing thought. He was pointing at something that thought cannot reach, and using thought to do the pointing, knowing that the pointing is not the destination. The trap within the trap is this. Every time you understand the teaching, you have made it a thought. And every time you make it a thought, you have potentially reinforced the very identification you were trying to see through. The concept I am awareness, not thought, is itself a thought. The belief I am the witness is a belief. The experience now I'm meditating correctly is an experience of the thinking mind evaluating its own performance. Osho's response to this trap was, characteristically, to turn it on itself. When a student would say, "I understand what you are saying," he would often reply, "Then you have not understood it. If you had understood it, you would not say you understand it. You would simply be it." Understanding is the mind's way of taking possession of what it cannot possess, of converting the open, spacious, boundless quality of direct recognition into a concept that the ego can own, catalogue, and use to further its sense of spiritual achievement. The recognition that he was pointing at is not an achievement. It is the cessation of achieving. It is not a new state to be reached. It is the recognition of the state that has been here all along, the ground on which all the achieving has been occurring, unchanged by the achieving, untouched by the failures. So what do you do if understanding is a trap, and effort is a trap, and technique is a trap, and what is left? Osho's answer always was the same: relax, not as technique, not as instruction, as the natural response to finally seeing that the running has had no destination, and the destination has been here all along. When you stop running, you don't arrive. You realize you are never anywhere else. The mind is not the only place the prison is built. This is an aspect of Osho's teaching that is sometimes underemphasized in favor of the more purely philosophical dimensions, the witness, the gap, the recognition of awareness. But Osho was insistent about it, and the insistence came from his clinical observation of what actually happens when people try to practice awareness while leaving their emotional life unexamined. What happens is this: the unprocessed emotion becomes the floor that the meditation cannot descend below. You can develop a certain quality of witnessing presence in the ordinary state, when the emotional weather is manageable. But when the grief hits, or the rage, or the fear, when the old content moves with its full force, the identification with the emotion is so complete, so total, so overwhelming, that the witness is temporarily unavailable. You don't observe the anger, you are the anger. The identity dissolves not into awareness, but into the emotional storm, and in the storm the practice that seems so stable in the calm is nowhere to be found. The reason, Osho pointed out, is that the emotion is carrying unexpressed content. Energy that was felt and then stopped, held, managed, suppressed, politely or forcibly contained, rather than allowed to move through and complete. The body knows when an emotion is incomplete. The body holds the charge of the incompletion, waiting for the conditions in which the movement can finish. And when those conditions don't arrive, when the pattern of suppression is maintained indefinitely, as it is in most socialized human beings, the charge accumulates, layer on layer, year on year, until the reservoir of held emotion constitutes a permanent background pressure that colors everything. Western psychology recognized this. Freud's concept of repression, Reich's concept of body armor, the entire tradition of somatic therapy that developed through the 20th century, all pointing at the same observation. The body holds what the mind will not allow. The tension in the shoulders, the constriction in the chest, the held breath, the chronic guarding in the belly, these are not mechanical dysfunctions. They are the body's record of what has not been felt. Osho took this observation and placed it within the larger framework of his teaching about identification and awareness. The repressed emotion is not just a psychological problem. It is an obstacle to the recognition of the witness, because the energy locked in the held emotion is energy that the awareness cannot move through. It is frozen, stuck, identified with, constituting a layer of the ego that is even more resistant than the cognitive layer, because it is held in the body and the body's holding is not accessible to reason. This is why the cathartic dimension of his meditation techniques, the shaking, the screaming, the dancing, the laughing, the crying, is not theatrical. It is functional. The body needs to complete the movements that social conditioning interrupted. The emotions need to move, to rise, to express, to pass through, not to be indulged indefinitely, not to be performed for an audience, but to be allowed their natural movement within the contained space of a meditation practice. When the body has moved what it needed to move, when the accumulated charge has had the opportunity to discharge through its natural channels of expression, something physical happens that is simultaneously psychological and spiritual. The body becomes lighter. The awareness that was blocked by the tension finds the tension gone. The meditation that could not descend below a certain floor finds the floor has dropped. The quality of presence that was available in good moments becomes available in difficult ones. Osho drew a distinction here that clarifies a great deal of confusion about his teaching's relationship to emotional expression. He was not advocating acting out, venting anger at the person who provoked it, expressing every emotion as it arises in every social context. Tormi is not the completion of the emotion. It is the dispersal of the emotion's energy into the external world in a way that generates consequences while leaving the underlying pattern intact. The pattern that generates the anger is not addressed by acting it out. It is merely expressed, and the expression creates new conditions that generate more anger. What he was advocating was something different. The completion of the emotion in a contained, witnessed spore where the energy moves, where the expression occurs, but where the expression is received by awareness rather than dispersed into reaction. The meditator who sits with the arising anger, who allows the anger's energy to move through the body without suppression, and without acting out, who witnesses the anger as the space of awareness witnesses any content. That meditator is doing something that neither suppression nor acting out accomplishes. They are allowing the emotion to complete itself while remaining the witness of its completion. This is the integration that Osho pointed at when he spoke about the body's wisdom. The body knows how to complete its emotional processes. The interference that prevents completion is not the emotion itself. It is the judgment about the emotion. The I should not feel this that suppresses it. The I am this feeling that identifies with it. the I must express this immediately, that disperses it before it can complete. Awareness, pure, non-judgmental, non-reactive awareness, is the condition in which the body's natural completion process can occur. And the practice of awareness is not just the sitting meditation. It is the moment-to-moment quality of presence that meets each arising emotion, not with suppression or identification or acting out, but with the simple, open recognition. There is this feeling. It is him, it is not me. This is the emotional equivalent of the gap between thoughts. The awareness that holds the feeling without being the feeling. And in that holding, the feeling, like the thought, moves through and passes. The past does not exist. This is not a philosophical claim about the nature of time. It is an observation about the location of your experience. Right now, in this moment, the past is not anywhere you can find it in direct experience. What you have is memory. A mental representation of something that occurred, constructed in the present, available in the present, and entirely present in its nature. The memory of yesterday is happening now. The thought about last year is happening now. The regret about 10 years ago is happening now. The future does not exist either. What you have is anticipation, imagination, projection, planning, worry, all of which are occurring now in the present as present tense mental events. Everything that you actually directly experience is happening now. The present moment is not one of three tenses. It is the only place experience occurs. Past and future are both present tense events, mental constructions that happen now in awareness, which is always and only now. Osho returned to this with an insistence that went beyond philosophical observation. He was pointing at something practical, something that changes everything when it is actually seen rather than merely understood. Because if the present moment is the only place experience occurs, if past and future are constructions that happen now, then the mind that is perpetually in the past or future is a mind that is perpetually missing the only place life is actually happening. This is the specific quality of mental suffering that he described most precisely. Not the suffering of bad events, that is unavoidable, and Osho had a great deal to say about the relationship between unavoidable pain and optional suffering. But the suffering generated by the mind's habitual departure from the present, the anxiety that is always about a future event, the regret that is always about a past one, the comparison that is always between the present and some imagined other time. These are not experiences of future or past suffering. They are present moment suffering about future and past. The worry about tomorrow is a pain you are feeling today, generated by a mental construction about a time that does not yet exist. The grief about what happened 5 years ago is a pain you are feeling now, generated by a mental replay of something whose moment has irrevocably passed. Osho was not saying that planning is wrong, or that learning from the past is wrong. He was saying that the habitual, compulsive, identity-sustaining residency and thought about other times, at the expense of presence to this time, is the mechanism by which the richness of actual experience is continuously missed. The present moment for most people is something they pass through on the way to a thought about another time. It is not a place they inhabit, and what the present moment contains, when you are actually in it, when the mental noise about other times has quieted enough to allow contact with what is here, is extraordinary. Not dramatic. Extraordinary in the way that what is always here but never noticed becomes extraordinary when it is finally noticed. The aliveness of the body, breathing, sensing, present in space, the quality of the air, the specific light of this specific moment, the sound of whatever is sounding, the vast, intimate, immediate reality of being here, not as a concept, as an experience, as the direct, unmediated, prior to interpretation experience of existing right now, in this place, in this body, in this awareness. This is what Osho called Zorba the Buddha, his image of the integration that was his teaching's final destination. Not the renunciate who rejects the world in favor of inner silence, not the worldly person who rejects inner silence in favor of sensory engagement, but the one who is fully, sensorially, distinctly engaged with the richness of the present moment from the foundation of the inner silence that the witness provides. Drinking the wine and tasting it completely, because the one drinking is present enough to actually taste. Loving the person and loving them fully, because the one loving is not absent in thought about other times. Working at the task and working with total absorption, because the one working is here, now, entirely. This is not a utopian state available only to the enlightened. It is available in glimpses right now, in any moment when the mind's habitual departure from presence is interrupted even briefly. You have had these moments. They do not announce themselves as spiritual experiences. They announce themselves as, suddenly, for no apparent reason, everything seems more vivid. The colours are more themselves. The air has a quality it didn't seem to have a moment ago. You are inexplicably simply here, without agenda, without commentary. Here. That is not a special state produced by a special circumstance. That is what presence feels like. Presence that is always available, always here, usually covered by the mind's residency elsewhere. The circumstance didn't produce it. The circumstance interrupted the covering. Osho's teaching is, in one formulation, very simple. Everything he taught across 30 years of daily discourse, across hundreds of volumes, across hundreds of specific techniques, it all amounts to this. Come back to here, come back to now, come back to what is actually occurring in the awareness that you are in this body, in this moment. The past is done, the future has not arrived. The only life that is actually happening is happening now, and now, if you are here for it, is more than enough. Osho said something about love that almost no one who talks about love says. He said, love and attachment are opposites, not complements, not different degrees of the same thing. Opposites. The more attached a relationship is, the more it is organized around possession, dependency, the need for the other person to behave in ways that confirm your self-image and fulfill your emotional deficits, the less love it contains, regardless of how the participants describe it. This is the kind of statement that provokes immediate resistance, because it runs directly counter to what most people have been taught to understand as the indicators of love. We believe that love is proved by need, that if you need someone, you love them. We believe that love is proved by exclusivity, that if you give yourself to one person, that giving constitutes love. We believe that love is proved by suffering, that if the relationship can hurt you, it must matter. Osho dismantled all of these equations with a precision that could be devastating if you were inside a relationship that the equations described. The person who needs you does not love you. They need you. Need is the cry of the incomplete, the attempt to find in another person the qualities that have not been developed within oneself. The person who cannot be alone needs company. The person who has not found peace within themselves needs the other to provide it. The person who has not developed inner security needs the other's presence to feel secure. All of this is real. The need is real. The dependency is real. The distress at the other's absence is real. But Osho's claim was that none of it is love. Love, in his analysis, is what happens when you don't need. When you are complete enough in yourself, not perfect, not without desire, not without the pleasure of company and closeness and the extraordinary gift of genuine intimacy, but complete enough that the other is a choice rather than a necessity. When you are with them because you delight in their presence rather than because their absence would undo you. When you can let them be what they are, fully, freely, without the constant pressure of your needs shaping who they are allowed to be, because your security does not depend on them being any particular way. This is the paradox that Osho returned to repeatedly. The person who is free in themselves, who has recognized the witness, who is rooted in the awareness that is prior to need and prior to the ego that generates need, that person is capable of love in a way that the needy person is not. Because they can give without demanding. They can be present without possessing. They can love without requiring the loved one to be the answer to the question of who they are. The needy relationship is, in Osho's language, two ego structures leaning on each other for support, each incomplete, each seeking in the other the completeness it lacks. And the specific tragedy of this arrangement, which describes to some degree most relationships, is that two incompletes leaning on each other do not produce one complete. They produce a system of mutual dependency that reinforces the incompleteness of each, because the incompleteness is the very thing that makes the dependency feel like love. Freedom in this context is not the freedom of isolation. Osho was consistently misunderstood on this point. His emphasis on individual completeness was read as a dismissal of relationship, as though the ideal he was pointing at was the solitary meditator who needs nothing from anyone. He rejected this reading explicitly. The free person does not avoid relationship. They enter it differently, from fullness rather than from lack. And the quality of what they bring to the relationship is fundamentally different from the quality of what need brings. The free person can actually see the other. The needy person can only see the other in terms of what the other does or does not provide. This is not cruelty. It is the inevitable consequence of the ego that is organized around its own deficits. The free person, not organized around deficits, is available to encounter the other as they actually are. Surprising, specific, irreducible, not the character in the story of your needs, but an actually existing person with their own interiority, their own mystery, their own being that is not available for possession. This is what Osho meant by love. The meeting of two presences, two awarenesses, two beings who are sufficiently in contact with their own depths that they can make genuine contact with each other's, not the merger that attachment seeks, which is actually the attempt to eliminate the other's separateness. The meeting that honours the separateness while bridging it, what Martin Buber called the I-thou relation, the moment in which the other is encountered as a subject rather than an object. And this meeting, this genuine presence-to-presence, awareness-to-awareness meeting, is what love at its most alive feels like. Not the comfortable dependency of long attachment, not the consuming intensity of projected idealization. Something cleaner, rarer, more demanding. The love that can only occur between people who are, at least partially and at least sometimes, actually here. We have come a long way from the thought you did not choose. We began there, with the bare, simple, easily overlooked fact that thoughts arrive without your permission, appear in your awareness without your choosing them, feel like yours without being chosen. And from that beginning we have traced the shape of an entire teaching. Osho's 40-year, multi-tradition, deliberately provocative, impossible to systematize, pointing at the single most important recognition available to a human being. You're not your thoughts. You're the awareness in which thoughts arise. This recognition, held in the body, not just the mind, felt in the gap between thoughts rather than understood as a concept about the gap, changes everything, not dramatically, not all at once, not in the way of a Hollywood transformation, with a specific moment of enlightenment after which everything is permanently different. In the quieter, more durable, more genuinely revolutionary way of a shift in the center of gravity. When the center of gravity is the ego, when you're identified with the thought stream, the self-concept, the character constructed from accumulated opinions and social conditioning, you are at the mercy of the weather, the thought weather. When good thoughts arise, you feel good. When bad thoughts arise, you feel bad. When anxiety arises, you are anxious. When confidence arises, you are confident. The state of the mind determines the state of the being. The weather in the room determines whether the room is pleasant or not. When the center of gravity shifts to the witness, when you are, even partially and temporarily, identified with the awareness that holds the thoughts rather than the thoughts themselves, something changes. Not the weather is still weather. Thoughts still arise, some of them beautiful and some of them frightening and some of them tedious and some of them deeply familiar in their particular quality of unhelpfulness. Emotions still move, difficulty still occurs, the world is still the world, but there is space. That is the word that comes back consistently in the accounts of people who have had even a glimpse of this shift. Space around the thoughts, space around the emotions, the recognition that the content is arising in something much larger than the content, that the stormy weather is happening in a sky that is itself unchanged by the storm, and the recognition of the sky, the sense of being the sky rather than the weather, does not make the storm less real. It makes the storm less total, less identity-destroying, less the final word about what is. Osho had a phrase for this quality. He called it the capacity to laugh at yourself, not the self-deprecating social performance of laughing at your own expense, the genuine, spacious laughter of a being who has seen through the ego's excessive seriousness, who recognizes the cosmic comedy of an infinite awareness spending a lifetime convinced that it is a finite thought stream and finds the recognition both humbling and liberating. He laughed a great deal. His discourses are full of humor, not the polite chuckle of social appropriateness, the genuine laughter of someone who is not protecting anything, who has nothing to defend, who can afford to find the situation funny because the situation, however serious its contents, is arising in a space that the seriousness cannot touch. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive aspect of his teaching's destination. You expect enlightenment, or whatever name you give the recognition he was pointing at, to be serious, grave, the achievement of a kind of cosmic solemnity appropriate to the weight of the understanding. What he consistently reported, and what those who were close to him reported about him, was the opposite. The recognition produces lightness, not the frivolous lightness of someone who doesn't understand the difficulty of things, the specific lightness of someone who understands the difficulty completely and is not crushed by it, who can hold the tragedy and the comedy simultaneously, who can be fully present to the suffering and fully present to the beauty, who can take life seriously without taking the ego seriously. The illusion that dissolves is not the world. The world remains, vivid, complex, sometimes painful, sometimes ecstatic, always specific in its textures and demands. What dissolves is the belief that you are the small, bounded, defensive, ego-organized character who has been moving through the world trying to protect its fragile story from the world's challenges. What remains is the awareness, open, undefended, present, not separate from the world, but not at the mercy of any particular content within it. The sky that holds the weather, the screen that holds the movie, the space in which thoughts arise and pass, unchanged by the passing, undiminished by the content, never having been anything other than what it is. You, the one who was there before the first thought, the one who will be there after the last, the one who is here right now reading these words, not the mind that is processing them, but the awareness in which the processing occurs. That awareness does not need to be achieved. It does not need to be produced. It does not need to be earned through correct meditation or correct understanding or correct behavior. It is here. It has always been here. The question that Osho spent his life asking, or the question he asked in 1,000 different ways with 1,000 different words pointing from 1,000 different directions, is not, how do you become it? The question is simply, have you noticed? In the gap between the last word and your next thought, right there, in that tiny, almost imperceptible space, something is present that the thought will cover when it arrives. Notice it, not for long, not permanently, not with the effort of achieving, just notice. That noticing, that bare, simple, effortless moment of recognizing the awareness that you are, is the whole of the teaching. Everything else was just the pointing,